Hi there, I'm Christopher Natsuume. I am the creative director and co-founder of a studio called Boomzap Entertainment. We're a casual game developer. We make games for mobile phones and PCs and things like that. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about how we run our studio. Our studio is a totally virtual studio, which means everybody lives at home, works from home. We don't have an office anywhere. And that's been the case now for 15 years. And in that time, we've been very successful. We've shipped a number of games. We've gotten great comments on our games. People love the work that we do. We've made millions of dollars like this. It's been a very successful venture for us. And as we all know, with things that are going on right now, a lot of people are looking a lot more seriously at working from home or running virtual studios than they were before. And I wanted to give people as much good information as I could about the way that we did it so that they can improve on their own processes. And so I made this video series to put that together. So this is the third of a 5-part series. In part 1, we talked about the reasons why you should be doing this or why this is a good idea. And there are lots of reasons beyond there's a massive pandemic destroying the world and everyone has to hide at home. There are other good reasons to do this. I talked about a lot of those in video 1. In video 2, we talked a little bit about the reasons why people might tell you can't do this, or the big problems that you might face in doing this and how we overcome a number of those problems. Those are great videos, and I hope you guys check those 2 out. I'm going to be doing 2 more videos after this where I talk very specifically about tools and very specifically about how you can work better as a person in this kind of environment. But in this video, video number 3, I want to dig down into our processes. How do we actually work? What does a day at our studio look like? How are people being tasked? And importantly, how are we finding people and managing people in this system? I get a lot of questions about this sort of thing, and so I want to dig down into that into some detail. Now, before I do that, I do want to point out that there is a danger here. There's a lot of information here, and a lot of the ways in which we work are sort of tooled to work with other things that we do. And so it may be tempting to look at this and say, I watched this video, and this guy who runs a virtual studio, he did this one thing, so we should do this thing. Maybe, but you need to look at how that thing has been working with the other things that we do. And if you're only taking part of this sort of recipe, you should be asking yourself, how does this piece of the recipe work with my recipe, which may be a very different recipe? You know, maybe you really like ketchup, but that doesn't mean you get to put ketchup on everything, right? I mean, there's some things that probably don't want ketchup. And if you're going to, put ketchup in the recipe, you probably ought to look at the rest of the recipe and make sure that the ketchup makes sense. So I'm not saying you have to do everything that we do exactly the way that we do it, but I do think you need to look at how we're doing things sort of in context. And if you're not going to change a lot of that context, maybe some of this stuff won't work for you as well as it's working for us. I just want to put that sort of up front and say that's something to be thinking about as you watch this. Now, all of that being said, I don't necessarily think all of this is just for virtual studios. I think there are a lot of people who could benefit from a lot of these processes. Even if you are going to be continuing to run a brick and mortar studio, I think a lot of what we're doing would fit into one of those models as well. I think it fits particularly well into what we're doing, but it would fit better into some of those, not better, but it would fit as well into some of those other models as well. So I don't think this is just virtual studios. I think there's a lot of good information here, but I want to jump right into it. The very first thing I want to talk about, I went in some depth into this. I'm not going to go as deeply into it in this video because I talked about it in video 2, is I think you really need to rethink the way that you're tasking people and the game theory of tasking. And again, if you go back and watch video 2, I don't want to get into this too deeply because I've already been through it. But the basic idea is, when people ask me, how do you track, whether or not people are in the studio or whether or not people are working, the big answer is we don't. I don't know when people are working. I don't know how many hours they worked, and I don't care. Pointedly, I just want to know that the tasks get done. So all of our tracking, all of our determining, who's in the office or blah, 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 none of that really exists for us. What really exists for us is we have a project. Here's what the project needs to get done to get the project done. Here's who's going to do those things. Here's when we need those things done. That's what the focus of everything is about. And I actually think whether you're in a virtual studio or not in a virtual studio, this is a much healthier way to look at projects than, how many man hours this is going to take. But thinking about time is probably not real healthy. Now, that being said, things do take time. And part of one of the reasons I think we are successful as a virtual studio is because the 2 founders of the studio come from working positions in the game industry. Before we started this studio and while we've been running this studio, my training is as a designer, and I've done level design and systems design and balancing, and I've done sound design as well. So I've got a lot of experience in the trenches doing things. My business partner, Alan Simonson, is a programmer, and he spent, all of his career before we started the studio and most of his time since we've been running this studio working as a programmer. And so when we're looking at tasks and saying, how long does this task take? How long is it going to, how many people do we need to assign to this? We have a pretty good idea of those things. I think this, I'll talk more about this when we get to hiring. If you're going to work in this model, it is important that the people that you have managing the process have a pretty good idea of these things, because you're going to run into this problem of, all right, it's Monday morning, I've got this big task list. How much of this do you expect to get done by the end of the week? And you have to have realistic expectations about those things, because I'm not going to know how many hours somebody put into that. So I'm going to have to know enough about these tasks to know, to do something like this probably should take 3 or 4 hours. So that's probably something they can do Tuesday morning. You have to at least know well enough to know that, and to know enough that when somebody comes back to you and says, hey, this thing that you thought was going to take 3 hours is taking me a lot longer because of X and Y and Z, and you can understand that information, you can process that, you can look at what's happening, and you can say, oh yeah, that does make sense. I think we need to adjust the schedule, and maybe you don't get this done by the end of the week because it's a bigger task than I thought it was, et cetera, et cetera. That level of experience is kind of necessary to work efficiently in this model. And if you don't have it, you need to make sure that the people you have tasking your teams have that level of experience. But once you have that level of experience, you can really focus down on what tasks need to be done and when do they need to get done. You don't really have to think so much about how many hours Bob is in the office. That's not a thing. And there's a whole game theory thing about this. I encourage you to go watch video 2. I talk about this in more detail. But when you're talking about anything else in this sort of production mechanic that I'm about to talk about, that understanding of how people work, that we're worried about their tasks and we're not worried about how many hours they're working, that's critical to understanding anything else that we do here. So that being said, one of the first comments I get from people, and it's a very reasonable comment, is, well, yeah, but how do you work together like that? If Gail's playing World of Warcraft for 2 hours a day because she finished all of her work early, what if somebody needs to talk to her and ask her questions about her work and that sort of thing? And that gets to, what does it mean if you're in Boomzap to be in the office? What does in the office mean to us? We have core hours. Our core hours are from 10 o'clock in the morning till about 5 o'clock at night. And those hours are set on Singapore time. Most of our studio works, and we'll talk about this more later, most of our studio works sort of in a similar north-south range. They work in places like Thailand and Indonesia and the Philippines and Singapore and Japan, which are all only a few time zones apart. And so we politely ask that everyone in the studio be around from the hours of 10 to 5 in Singapore. Right, which is when we talk about time in the studio, we always speak in Singapore time because we're a Singapore studio officially. That's where we're registered. And so during those hours, you need to be able to answer questions quickly. Now, I don't care what you're doing. I don't care. You can be at the daycare hanging out with your kids, or you can be at the park having a picnic. You can be doing whatever it is you want to do in the middle of the day. I really don't care, because we live in a world where everybody's got this device they can put in their pockets that you can talk to them wherever they are in the world. And as long as they are in contact, I don't care if you're working, right? And this is very important to understanding, both parts of that equation. One, I do care that you finish your job. I do care that you finish these tasks. And I do care that you finish them in a timely manner. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But whether you did them this morning or whether you did them this afternoon or whether you did them this evening, unless I've got somebody else waiting on you today to finish something, which we will talk about in the morning if that's something that is true. If Bob needs you to finish this so that he can get some work done at lunch, then we're going to have a chat in the morning when you show up and say, hey, today I really need you to get this done before lunch because Bob's waiting on you, right? We'll have that chat in the morning, and we'll talk about these chats here in a second. But unless there's some today time critical thing, when you did this work today is really inconsequential to me. What is important to me is if it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon and Bob is running into a problem with your code and he doesn't understand how it works and he needs to ask you a question about it, you need to be available for Bob to ask you that question. And you could be anywhere when that's happening, and it's not important that you be working right then. You could be in the middle of a raid in World of Warcraft. Maybe you're going to take a couple minutes out of your raid to answer Bob's question, but that's fine as long as you're there to answer Bob's question. And so those core hours are critical, and we're very hardcore about that. 10 o'clock in the morning, if I ask you a question, and we'll talk more about this in tools, but what it means to be in the studio, in our studio, means that you're logged on to Slack, which is the communications program that we use. It's a very nice communications program. We like Slack a lot. And if you're on Slack, you're in the office. And by on Slack, that means if I tag you, if I say, at Alan question, I expect an answer from you within a couple minutes at the longest, right? Preferably within a minute or so, I expect an answer. But I understand that maybe you're working on some piece of code, or maybe you're talking to somebody. Maybe you need a couple minutes to sort out whatever you're doing. But I expect you to be able to drop whatever it is you're doing and answer my problem and help me sort out my problem within a minute or two if I tag you on Slack. That's what it means to be in the office during our core working hours. Now, there are certainly people in the studio that are in other time zones. We have, for instance, one of our programmers is in Russia. He works earlier than a lot of people do. He wakes up a lot earlier than other people do because he needs to be around for those hours. And it's one of the reasons why we do preferentially hire people that are in a similar time zone to us. They can be as far north or south as they want to be, but they have to be willing to be available during most of those core hours. Now, we've got a couple people that are really great folks that we bend that rule a little bit, and everyone on the team knows, hey, this guy doesn't show up until about noon because, noon is actually 6 a.m. in his time. But we do ask that people be there during those hours when it's all possible. It's a thing that we take into account when we hire, and it's something we're preferential for to make sure that they can be there in those hours, because I do expect most of the staff to be around during that time. So that's a huge part of being in the office. Now, the other part of that is we expect people to let us know if you're not going to be around during those hours. And that's certainly reasonable. People take lunch, people need to go pick their kids up from daycare, et cetera, et cetera. There's things that are happening. And so what we have, and I'll talk more about this when we talk about exactly how we use Slack, but we make sure that when people are going to be away for more than 5 or 10 minutes, that they let us know that they're going to be there. And you're in a project group, you're working with the people who you're really interacting with on a constant basis, and you let them know, hey, I'm going to be gone for about 2 hours. I've got to go, do X. And then everyone's like, oh, crap, I need to ask this guy a question. Oh, he'll be back in like an hour. And we all know he'll be back in an hour. And this isn't really so different than you might run into in a normal brick and mortar studio where maybe somebody's in a meeting or somebody had to step outside to go to a dentist appointment or something like that. It's still the same thing. But we have the advantage of, hey, if you went out to that dentist appointment and you're sitting in a dentist's office, probably you're sitting in the waiting room and you can probably answer that question. So our people are actually more available in those situations than a lot of people in brick and mortar studios who aren't used to working like that. So that's what it means to be in the office in our studio. And this is a very, very important part of our studio. And it's something we bang into people's heads. If I wake up at 10 o'clock and I need to talk to some people about some stuff on a project and they're not there, if that happens a couple times, we're going to have a very hard talk about whether or not you want to be in this studio or not, because that communication is extremely important to us. It's just as important as showing up at work if you were in a brick and mortar studio and being there, on time to get work done and show up for meetings. So that's our being in the office. Now, that being said, we like to embrace this sort of asynchronicity, right? And this is something that we have a huge power over that a brick and mortar studio doesn't. And one thing to think about, if you imagine a normal studio and there's a bunch of communication happening in that studio, maybe 5 people are over next to the water cooler getting water and they're talking about, hey, Bob, I was talking about this new design idea and I don't think it's a really good idea. Maybe we should do X and Y and Z. And so, I don't know. And they have this conversation. One of the real problems in communication in any kind of studio is, how did that get conveyed to the rest of the team? Right? If those 3 or 4 people sitting around the water cooler had that chat, and maybe it is an important chat, maybe they come up with some interesting ideas, did the people who were over in their cubicle or over in their office somewhere with their headphones on doing some programming, did they hear any of that? No, they didn't. That information is now lost to anyone who wasn't in that conversation. And now there's sort of 2 streams in the studio, the stream of people who know that and a stream of people who don't know that. And they're going to continue on about their work, one team doing stuff based on that information, one team doing, unless somebody took the time to stop and say, hey, we had a conversation by the water cooler, I'm going to let everyone know about it. We have a real advantage in that water cooler doesn't exist in our studio. That water cooler is a number of conversation groups in, Slack channels in Slack. And so let's say that same 3 or 4 people got to talking about, somebody was sitting and they were working and they're kind of confused and they're like, I don't know if this is a good idea. And they go into the proper Slack channel and they talk to people in that Slack channel and say, hey, blah, 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 blah. And they have that conversation. There's now a written record of that conversation. And somebody else who might not have been there for that conversation we'll go back and read that and say, whoa, wait, I think these guys totally misunderstand the situation. This is actually supposed to be like this. And they can come in later and say, hey, I read through your chat and I think you guys misunderstood blah, right? And that's something that doesn't happen in a brick and mortar studio. But because we have this sort of asynchronous relationship with our staff where things are being recorded in different times, we actually do have those written records. And it's really, really powerful. And it's something, even if we were in, and it's funny because there have been times where we've all gotten together and worked somewhere for one reason or another. We thought it'd be fun to work together in the Philippines for a little bit because of a party or something like that. And we would find ourselves in a room and we would find ourselves still working like that. We wouldn't actually be talking to each other. We'd still be chatting in chat groups because we recognize the power of those chat groups and the power of having all of that sort of live instant documentation that we have. It's actually really interesting. Now, that being said, there's other things that you can do to embrace this asynchronous relationship. One interesting thing is every now and then I have a lot of information that I want to give to the staff. Hey, there's a new project that we just picked up and there's a bunch of stuff that I want to tell you about it. And, normally they'd be like, okay, let's have a big meeting and we have to call everybody in the meeting and everybody's got to take time off of what they're doing and we have to wait until everybody's not at the doctor or whatever. And now we have the meeting and now we talk about it. And there's always 2 or 3 people that weren't there. So somebody's got to write up notes for the meeting. But we replaced that in our studio with what I call the banjo tapes. And it comes from, we did a game a long time ago that had this really terrible banjo music in it. And everybody hated me because I put this banjo music in it. And so from then on, every time I wanted to irritate the team, I would make them listen to this banjo music. So anyway, what I do is when I have something important to talk to the team about, I'll actually record a little podcast. And sometimes it's 30 minutes, sometimes 15 minutes. But when I have a big, long, complicated thing where I want everyone to understand something, I want them to understand it in context, and I don't want to write some great big email that nobody's going to read, I actually make a little podcast like that, which it doesn't take long. I open up Audacity and it takes me 30 minutes to read into this microphone. I tell them what I need to tell them. I can edit out the parts that were wrong and fix the parts. And I can really think about what I want to tell people. And then usually I edit a little bit of banjo music at the beginning and the end of it to make it sound fun. And then I drop that in the Slack channel, the main company Slack channel. And I say, hey, everybody, there's a bunch of information that you need. It's all in this thing. Here's a little bullet list of the main topics that I'm going to talk about. And this is really powerful for a couple of reasons. One, it gives a lot of people a chance to listen to this when they want to listen to this, right? I don't want to go to a meeting right now because my head's in something else. I'm doing something else, but I'll get back to that in 30 minutes. I don't have to wait for that guy, right? That person can listen to this in 30 minutes. But also for a lot of our staff, they all speak English very well, but for some of them, English is a second language. And sometimes if this were a big conversation, they might not want to interrupt me in the middle of it and say, hey, Chris, I didn't understand what you just said a second ago. Can you say that again? Well, now they have 2 options. One, they can rewind it and they can, play it again and maybe they catch it the second time. Or 2, now they have a kind of fair forum to come in and say, hey, Chris, you said something in your video about, or in your podcast about this thing. Does that mean this and this and that? And they can put all those questions, because usually you're like, save the questions till the end. Well, they now have to save the questions to the end. And you get this, and it's not just people who have, trouble with English. It's also people who are introverts or have trouble speaking up in a group. A lot of those people will sometimes private message me after that. And they'll say, hey, Chris, I didn't understand this one thing. Can you explain this one thing to me? And it's a much more comforting, they don't have to talk out in front of the big group, etc. They have a really nice back channel to say, hey, Chris, this one thing, I didn't want to say it in front of everybody, but I don't know if that's a good idea or something like that. And that's great because 9 times out of 10, I'll take that same conversation, I'll go back to the main thread and I'll say, hey, a couple people were asking me, blah, here's the answer to that. And I'll find out that for every one guy who came and told me they had a question, there were 5 other people in the studio that actually had the same question, but they hadn't really gotten around to saying it or asking it. So it's a really powerful way to use this sort of asynchronous relationship to communicate with the staff. And I do this quite often, actually. And we did, I was involved in a program with Google where we did one of these great big sort of staff evaluations and whatnot that Google was training us how to do. And that showed up in that evaluation as one of the favorite things that the studio liked about the way that we operated our studio, because they felt it was a great transfer of information. So in many ways, I feel like this virtual studio that we've got actually disperses information to the staff and opens up sort of a transparent relationship with the staff in a lot of ways better than brick and mortar studios do, because we're forced to think about that level of communication in a way that you take for granted in a brick and mortar studio, but which isn't always correct. So that's something that's actually pretty important in our sort of asynchronous communication. In general, we try to avoid meetings. I've found that they're not great, not just in a virtual studio, but in any studio. I find people waste a lot of time in meetings. And so we spend a lot more time in sort of asynchronous chats, which may take a little longer. But sometimes they're more powerful because more people get involved. People have time to go away and think about stuff and come back with real answers. It's a different kind of communication. It's a little bit slower, but I think it's a lot more powerful. And every now and then there does come the time when, all right, we need to talk. We need to have a conversation. We've been chatting about this online for, an hour, and it doesn't really seem like we're reaching a resolution. That does happen every now and then. And when that does happen, there's no reason why we can't chat, right? Just like you could, and just like you would in a brick and mortar studio, at some point you'd say like, look, we need to have a meeting. We need to talk about this. Let's put everyone in a room. At that moment in our studio, it's let's open a Slack conversation, like a voice conversation. And usually we'll share somebody's screen. I'll talk more about this when we talk about Slack, but we'll all go into a call and we'll discuss something in a call. And at the end of that call, somebody will write the notes out and they'll put that note there. And this is actually really nice because how it shows up in Slack is conversation. Somebody says, hey, let's have a call. And then boom, there'll be a call happened now because Slack puts that in the thread. And then afterwards, there'll be a little note. Hey, this is what we talked about in that call. And now this is this great way for staff to look and see like, this is what happened while I was at the dentist today. And I can now get all that information. In many cases, we actually even record that conversation so they can go back and listen to that conversation if that's something that I think people wanted to have later. We don't do that as much as we used to because people just ended up not listening to them very much because we always had notes on it. But that's something that you could look into doing as well. But I think, when you put yourself in this virtual studio model and you say, look, you can work from home, it lends itself so well to the next step, which is, look, you don't just have to be free in time, but you can be free. I mean, so you don't have to just be free in space, but you can be free in time as well. And you can adjust the way that you work. And this asynchronicity is really, really powerful. There are people that work better in the morning. There are people that work better at night. There are people that work better when people leave them alone. And, there are people who have things going on in their lives where, you know what, maybe they're available to chat with you during the day, but their kids are behind them and they're screaming and yelling during the day. Or maybe they just want to spend time with their kids during the day because they like their kids. That happens. And so maybe that person wants to do their work in the evening and they just want to be in communication during the day. That happens a lot in our studio, and it's very powerful because it lets people lead the lives that they want to lead. They don't have to say like, look, I would really love to spend more time with my kids, but when the kids are awake, I got to get in a car and go down to an office and work. You know what? Spend time with your kids. Do your stuff with your kids. And then when the kids are in bed at night, sit down and do that great big hunk of work. We have people that work like that. And it's fine as long as they're in communication during those hours. This kind of asynchronicity is really, really powerful. And I think people don't use it nearly enough. It's this really cheap way to get a way better life. And quite honestly, to get more work done. So the next sort of question that we get a lot of, how do you do this? Is about how we do our documentation. And, at some level, we're a studio just like you are, and we document just like you do. And quite honestly, I would document the same whether I were in a virtual studio or whether I were not in a virtual studio because it's a more powerful way to document. And the quick answer to that is we have very concise, collaborative, updated documentation, right? I guess you could call it the 3 C's, right? Collaborative, what was it? Collaborative, and I had 3 C's in my head. What was it? Collaborative, current, and concise. Those are the 3 C's of documentation. Starting off with, all of the documentation tools that we use are collaborative. We haven't done documentation in a Microsoft Word doc since we started the studio. Every time I see somebody who's got a Microsoft Word document, I'm like, wow, 1992 called and they want their documentation back. Like, stop this. That's not a healthy way to document. When we discuss things, when we get into chats and we have a bunch of people on the Slack chat, usually somebody is sharing a screen. And usually when we're sharing that screen, or even if we're not sharing that screen, we're all looking at the same page in a Google slide. And actively interact with that Google slide while we're talking. Let's say we're trying to figure out a piece of UI out, and I've got 3 artists and I'm in there. We're all grabbing stuff that we're looking at, and we're talking to each other saying, I think maybe this button is too large, or maybe the player doesn't understand that. And somebody could just grab it and move it and say, no, why don't you put it here? It actually comes out, it takes the same place as, people are like, well, it's really important for us to get around the whiteboard. We have a whiteboard. It's called Google Slides. And we go to and it's great because, you have your whiteboard, and when you're done playing around with your whiteboard in your brick and mortar studio, now somebody's got to go document all of that. And I don't know, did it translate or whatever? We already have the document. It's the Google Slides. We just went through it. So what usually happens when we document something, let's say we come up with a new game design idea that we need to, or maybe we're looking at a game design and there's some problems. Somebody's gone and taken some screenshots. They put them in a slide. They've prepared something and they've said, look, here's the problems. Look, here, this is wrong, or maybe we could make this bigger. And they've kind of outlined that so that everybody can see it. And we are all going to look at that at the same time. We're going to interact with it at the same time. And while we're talking about it, somebody else who also has access to that document might grab something and say, well, have you thought about this, or draw something? We use, we use Slack, but other programs have the same thing, have tools allow you to draw on the screen. And a lot of times, one of the artists will draw a box and say, well, you could put it here, or you could do it here. I actually think we have stronger get around the whiteboard potential in the way that we work than places that have a meeting where you all get around the whiteboard. It's actually extremely powerful. So all of our documentation is collaborative like that. It's also important because we don't ever do versioned docs, right? If you go back in history, and I think a lot of us older folks remember this, the younger people I don't think deal with this nearly as much. It used to be the world of do you have the most recent version of the design doc, right? This current issue of, which design doc, the last week's or this week's, who touched it? We don't have that. There is the design doc, and there's somebody who owns that. It's his responsibility to make sure that that thing is updated on time. When it's updated because there's only that one version. So if we had a big conversation about something, or, something changed, or the programmer just put something new together and that changed the way we think about something, somebody goes back into that document and updates that document so that it's current with the way the world exists right now. Because of that, at any given time, if somebody wants to know how does this work, or what is this thing, they can go to that documentation and it's current. It has screenshots from our current game. It has notes from the last talk that we had. It's very important to keep that stuff current. And this is really critical. The third C, if you're going to be current, you really need to be concise. Updating all that documentation, if you have a lot of documentation, is going to be very time consuming. And you really don't want to spend that time and energy doing that. So you think very hard about how many documents do you really need, and how much of this really needs to be documented. We'll talk more about this when we get into tools and stuff, but I use a lot more pictures and a lot more screenshots and a lot more references and a lot fewer words. And that makes all of this documentation get read faster, and it makes it faster to update. A lot of times when we want to say, hey, this is what we want to do, it's screenshot, put it in Google Slides, draw a couple boxes over it, put a couple notes, done. That's very quick to do. If I were to try to describe that in words in a Microsoft Word document, it would take a very long time. And because it takes time to do that, people just aren't going to update it. And because it doesn't get updated, that document dies and it becomes worthless very quickly. So when you're doing your documentation, collaborative, current, concise, the 3 C's. I'm gonna write that. I should put that down somewhere. That sounds cool. So that's how we do documentation. So the next question that we get a lot about is, how do we handle tasking? How do we task our team? 3 really critical points to this. 1, daily tasks. 2, daily reports. 3, weekly goals, right? I'll start with the last one. When a week starts, I've got somewhere a schedule of when we want this project to be done. And, we've done some kind of recent sprint where we said, this is what our nearest, 2-week or whatever goal. We're not like totally Scrum adherent, but we do use a lot of sort of agile type methodology. And one of those is, we're thinking very clearly about what's the next week and what's the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks going to look like. What do we need to get done to get to some relatively close goal that we can actually see and envision? Maybe we're putting a prototype together. Maybe we're putting an alpha together. Maybe we're putting a design doc together, something like that. So all of this is broken down into, what are we going to get done right now this week? And everyone on the team gets given a clear weekly goal at the beginning of the week. And there's somebody on that team whose job it is to give them that goal and to monitor that goal and to check and see if that goal got done at the end of the week. We'll talk more about how we do that in tools in a little bit. We use Trello for most of that, but I don't think Trello is necessary. It's one of many tools that you could use that. There's plenty of tools that you could use to do that. Honestly, you could use a bunch of Post-it notes, but it's hard to do that on a online thing. Trello works well for that. But the critical part of the thing is not which tool you use, but the idea that at the beginning of the week, everyone knows this is what I'm responsible for this week. And at the end of this week, if that's not done, I'm not done. That's the critical part of all of this, right? And critically, that information is shared with everybody else on the team, right? Usually what that shows up as is at the beginning of the week, somebody puts in Slack a little bullet list of, okay, this week, boom, 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 this is what you're doing. And each one of those has got a little tag for the, okay, at Carlo, you're going to do this, at June, you're going to do this, at Bless, you're going to do this. So now we have a list of, here's what the people on this team are supposed to be doing this week, right? And everybody responds to that and says, cool, yeah, that sounds reasonable, I'll do that. So once we've kind of agreed that's what you're going to do this week and you're off to do it that week, there are two very critical things that everyone on the staff has to do. Number one, they have to tell you at the beginning of the day, this is what I'm going to do today, right? And so that's sort of how you check in. That's our time clock at the beginning of the day. So somebody, let's say one of our artists, Bless, she's going to start her day at the studio. And the first thing she does when she checks in is she's going to go to her project group and she's going to say, today I'm going to work on this hidden object scene, or today I'm going to work on this character, right? And everybody in the studio gets that information. So we can all say, okay, that's what Bless is going to be up to today, right? And if anyone in the studio disagrees with that, like maybe I'm supposed to be working on a thing and I need Bless to finish some piece of user interface for that and I can't work until that's done, I might pop up and say, hey, Bless, can you not do that today? Can you do this piece of user interface today? Because I need that to do something I'm doing tomorrow. That's all in the chat and people sort that out. So now the day has begun. That's what Bless is going to do. At the end of the day, when Bless is done with her day, she puts a daily report together. And the daily report is, again, very, very concise. It's usually just a bullet list of, here's what I did today. And it has a link to whatever it is she did. So if she put together a new character, here's a link to the picture of the character in Basecamp where we store it. Or, if she put together a new piece of documentation, here's a link to that doc or whatever. So here's what I did today. Here's where you can go check it out. In most cases, and this is very important, if you're doing something that is part of the build, if it's part of the game, let's say you're making a character that needs to go into the game, it's not done until it's in the game. So you might say, hey, I made this character, here's a picture of this character, I put it in the patch folder and it's now ready to be put, and we'll talk more about this in tools. It's now in the game and you can go play the game and test it and you can see that it's there. Daily reports, daily tasks, right? And this doesn't take much out of the person's time. To put together your daily task, that's literally one message on Slack. It's very quick. To put together your daily report, it's literally a couple bullet points and a link to whatever you did. Now, if I'm the manager in charge of that, each one of our projects has a project manager, I'm going to check every day and I'm going to see, did this get done? She said she was going to do this morning. At the end of the day, did it get done? And, if it didn't get done, usually there's a note in her daily reports that says, hey, this took longer than I thought, or June pulled me aside and made me do this other thing, so I did this other thing instead, so I'll get back to that tomorrow, or something like that. There'll be some information about why didn't she do the thing that she said she was going to do today. At the end of the week, the project manager in charge of that project is going to look and say, okay, this is what we said we were going to get done this week. Is it all done? Go through staff member by staff member. If it's done, great. Have a nice weekend. Good work. If it's not done, we're going to figure out why. Why did this not get done? Did something stop you from working? Blah, 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 blah. But, hey, you said you were going to have this thing done. Now, usually, because people know if they get to Friday and they're not done, the response from our studio is, I'm afraid you don't have a weekend this weekend. You're going to be working through the weekend. They're going to jump up much earlier in that process. They're not going to wait until Friday and let you know that they're not done. They're going to tell you like Tuesday or Wednesday, dude, I have gotten into this task. There's no way this thing's going to be done by this weekend. And now we can have a chat about it. We can say, well, why isn't it going to be done by this weekend? Do you need more people on this task? Do you need more resources? Is this being badly planned or the tools are not working? Usually that conversation happens way earlier because they know if on Friday they said that it was going to get done and it's not done, they're going to lose their weekend. They're going to let me know as soon as possible that what they want to do can't be done in the time that we thought it was going to be done. And that's fine. That's great. Sometimes you're wrong in your tasking. Sometimes problems come up. So that's kind of the core to how we task things. And a corollary to that, and this is very game studio specific, we do a daily build every single day. And this is critical. Whoever the programmer, the lead programmer in charge of the project is, they are required to do a build every single day. That build is done at the same time every single day. Everybody knows if you want to get your stuff in the build, it needs to be put in by this time during the day. So, for instance, one of our projects, Last Regiment, we do a build every day at 8 o'clock. And if you want to have your stuff in the build at 8 o'clock, it better be checked in by 7, because that's when the programmer goes through and makes sure everything works and there's not any problems and blah, blah, blah. So if your stuff isn't done by 7, it's not getting in the build today. It's in the build tomorrow. And so if you want to say, hey, I did my stuff and it's done and I finished it today, you need to have it turned in by 7 and it's in the daily build. And for a lot of stuff, especially for programmers who are fixing things, or putting together features, if it's not in the build, it's not done. If you tell me, hey, I built this whole user interface, I'm not going to go look at your Photoshop files. I'm going to open the build and see is it in the build. If it's not in the build, it's not done yet. And I want to know why it's not done yet, because you knew it was supposed to be done. It was supposed to be checked in by 7. So that heartbeat of the studio, every day at 7, people are checking in their files. Every day at 8, that build gets done. That build is now available. Everybody downloads that build. The other critical part of this is tomorrow morning when everybody shows up for work and they want to start working again, the absolute first thing they do, they grab that build, they load that build up on their machine, and now I've got the most recent version of this game to work with as I'm putting new assets, as I'm working with it, as I'm testing, as I'm doing the things that I need to do. This is a critical part of our process. If it ain't in the build, it ain't done. And another corollary to this is you test your own stuff before you put it in the build. If you broke my build, you're going to have a talk with me, the project manager, right? If Adrian is putting together the build at 7 o'clock and the build crashes and it's because your code is broken, you're going to have a hard talk with me because you had the most recent version of the build and you had the time to test your stuff. And you're not going to push that off to somebody else and make them test that or make them figure out what you did wrong. Your stuff can't crash the build. That's your fault and you broke it, right? So every day you're going to give me a daily task of what you're going to do today. At the end of every day, you're going to tell me, what did you do today? You're going to have your stuff checked in for the build to get made. The build is going to get made. I'm going to check that work in the build. And if you broke that build, you're going to have a hard talk with me about why you checked in broken work. That thing, that whole package is really, really critical to running a successful virtual studio. That thing is sort of the beast that sits underneath all the other process and stuff we put in it. If that part doesn't work, all of the rest of it kind of breaks down a little bit. There is one corollary I'll add to that. Even though we only do daily reports once a day, because I don't want to overload the team with too much reporting, I do ask that all of the artists working on our project submit works in progress twice a day. So if, let's say, for instance, one of my artists is working on a character, I want to make sure that that character is going in the appropriate direction, because the last thing I want to have happen is to have one of my artists work all day on something and then she turns it in and you're like, whoa, that's totally not what we needed. We needed something different, right? I've now wasted a day of her time and she's going to be very angry with me because she's got a weekly goal that she's trying to meet and I've just blown a day of her weekly goal. That's a day that she could have spent playing World of Warcraft or doing whatever it is she wants to. I don't know why I'm so obsessed with Warcraft in this video series. I swear my team does stuff other than play World of Warcraft. But what we do to prevent that is minimum, and this is minimum of twice a day. If somebody's working on some piece of art, they just grab a screenshot straight out of Photoshop, right? And this isn't a long process or anything like that. It's literally just print screen, plop in Slack. Hey, I'm working on this character. Does this look like what you wanted? And whoever it is that has the responsibility of, whoever asked for this thing to get built is going to look at it and go, oh, no, that's not. Or, hey, yeah, that looks great. Keep working on that. And these are really great for our team. They're really great moments for, because again, this is not just a virtual studio. This is any studio ought to work like this, but it's especially important in a virtual studio where that artist may be somewhere out in Indonesia in a room all by herself, and she doesn't know if she's doing the right work or not. And she's really scared that she's going to do the wrong work all day and she's going to waste her whole day and that's going to suck. right? And she doesn't want that to happen. So if she submits that work in progress at noon before she goes to lunch, and somebody says, "That's great, that's exactly what we want," she now knows her morning was well spent, and that's a little good. Okay, now after lunch I'll keep working on that, and I'm working towards my goal. And this is what makes people happy over time, removing that doubt or removing that fear that what they're doing is the wrong thing. So that's it. I mean, I know people think that there's some sort of other magic or anything like that, but this is the heart of our studio. We don't track hours, we track tasks, right? We have constant communication with the team where you answer questions quickly between the hours of 10 and 5. We have, what were the 3 C's again? We have collaborative, concise, current documentation that people can look at any time. We do daily tasks, daily reports, weekly goals. If you're an artist, you do works in progress twice a day. At the end of every day, we have a build. Your stuff's in the builder, it's not done. Literally, that's it. That's our studio. That's how we run. And it's really that straightforward and simple. People want to make this way more difficult than it is. It's not. Now, there's a lot of little odds and ends and things that go with that, and a lot of different ways that we use tools to make this better. And I actually have a whole nother video talking about those tools and how we use those tools to get to these goals. But to be honest, the tool part, that's just how we do it. There are other tools that would do this just as well. There's other tools that might even do it better, and I'd love to hear about some of them. There are tools that we have replaced, and we didn't always use Trello, and it was by adding one of our project managers, Tony, came in, and he was a big fan of Trello, and he talked us all into using Trello. Now we use Trello. So there are improvements that can be made. There's different tools that can be used, but this core thing I just talked about, the heart of our production process, that could be played across any of a number of tools. It can be adjusted, but that's the heart of how we do our studio. So that's the first half of this video. I'm going to take a drink of tea for a second. Talking like this for this long, it dries out my throat. I apologize. I got better stuff to do than to edit out me drinking tea. So you get to watch that. The next thing I want to talk about is how we hire for this. I want to start with, there's something people say. People say, like, our most important asset is our people. And they always say it, but they never mean it. I want to tell you the absolute honest truth about running most companies these days. People are not an asset because you don't own them. Assets are things that you own. You don't own people. People choose to work with you because they like what you provide them, whether it's money or stability or interesting work or whatever. Every day you have the responsibility to make your, and this is my view as a manager. Every day you have the responsibility, this is your key goal, the responsibility to explain to everybody in the staff that what they're doing here at your studio is the best possible thing that they could be doing with their life right now. I know that sounds pretty heavy-handed, but a lot of people talk about, are your staff loyal and blah, blah, blah. Nobody owes me loyalty. Nobody owes me anything. It's quite the opposite. As an employer, it is my job to ensure that everyone in my studio is living their best life, that what they're doing here is the best possible thing that they can do for themselves. And as long as that is true, I'll have loyalty. That loyalty will be based on the fact that they're acting in their own self-interest. This is where they are because this is what's best for them, right? And once you have that, the real asset is not the people, because again, you don't own the people. They can leave anytime they want. The asset that you have is a process and a situation and a framework in which those people can operate well and can work well. It's this intangible thing. Assets, it doesn't matter. Boomzap doesn't own any assets. I own a couple, I buy some computers and mobile phones for people to test things on, but we don't have an office, and most people don't. Most people rent that anyway, right? We don't have a huge bank account full of cash. We don't really own anything. The thing that we have is our company culture and our company framework and an institutional knowledge and understanding of how we work and how we do things. That's our actual asset. The people that are involved in that, they're not an asset. They can leave at any time. But that thing that we share together, this relationship that we have together, that's the actual only asset that we have as a studio. And so when I'm thinking about what I'm spending my time on, I'm thinking about how do I protect and improve that asset. How do I protect and improve our production process, our understanding, our interaction with each other, our understanding of what it means to be Boomzap or to be at Boomzap? And the number one, most important, absolute, critical part of that process is hiring, right? Because that's created by us. It's not created by me. It's created by the whole studio. And if you bring a bunch of Nimrods into the studio, you're going to have a studio full of Nimrods, and they're going to do Nimrod things. And the value of the only asset that you have is going to drop, right? And if you bring in great people and you support great people and you make those great people happy, that whole thing rises. And the value of what you now have is that glue that holds all those people together. I know that sounds really trippy dippy and heady or whatever, but if you learn nothing else from my videos, please learn that as a manager, that is the asset. That's the thing that you own. And the most important thing you can do when trying to make that better is hire the right people. And it's important that I say the right people and not better people. There are different kinds of people that are going to work different in different kinds of places and different kinds of relationships. And I would suggest that in a virtual studio, there are some aspects of people that are going to work out better, or at least have worked out better in my studio. And that may not make them the best people. There might be somebody that works out great working in a brick and mortar studio like Blizzard that would never survive in my studio. That's maybe a thing. But all I know is what works for me and what works in my studio. We're going to go over that. And the number one thing I would say is hire fewer people that can do more work, right? I won't lie and tell you that management of a virtual studio is easy. There is a little bit of overhead with that. And where, I've been to China and I've seen great big huge Chinese studios, and you walk in and there's literally 500 people in a warehouse, every one of them with a computer, and they're all banging away. And you really probably wouldn't want to run that as a virtual studio. Or if that was your virtual studio, you'd want to take those 500 people and split them into 40 or 50 10-person teams that are independently working, because that's going to be the easiest way to manage them. I would say that you're going to want to focus on bringing that number down as low as you can. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have a big virtual studio. We had a studio that was almost 100 people at one point. We're now about 25 people, which is a nice number. I like 25 people as a studio. That's a nice number of people to manage. We know each other all well. It's a friendly, nice number. I like a studio of about 25 people, but that's just my personal preference. But if you're going to have a studio of 25 people and you still want to do great things, you need to make sure that those are people that can each individually do a lot of work. And so we preferentially hire towards paying a little bit more for our staff and hiring in really good, really experienced, really smart people. And I'll walk through a couple of the sort of the biggest traits that we look for that are sort of critical to success where we are. I have a list. I can get this all right. Number one, we want to make sure that they work with minimal management. Right? These are independent people that they don't really need you asking them what to do every day, because they kind of manage themselves. They're very self-managing people. Because keep in mind, this is somebody who's going to be sitting at a desk in her, study in a small room on the other side of an ocean from you. And you're not going to be standing over her shoulder and saying, hey, you need to do that thing. Like, that's not a thing that you can do. And so you need her to be the kind of person that is a go-getter. She's going to be doing that stuff whether you tell her to do it or not. And I would say of all the different things you're looking for in a virtual studio, that thing is important, because there are going to be times when she runs into a problem and she can't do her work right now because she needs something from somebody else. Or maybe she doesn't understand how to do this particular thing. Or maybe there's going to be all kinds of things that are going to stop her. And she needs to be the kind of person that's not just going to stop and say, like, well, I tried to do it and it didn't work, and then wait for somebody to get on her case about it. She's got to be the person that when she stopped from working, she's going to reach out to somebody and say, hey, I was trying to do this thing and I couldn't do it, and I thought about doing this and that didn't work. Do you know how to do this thing? That kind of independent, empowered, self-reliant kind of person, that's by far the most sort of critical thing that you need to make happen for any individual in your studio. They need to be people who are just, and this is something you can teach people your process, you can teach people skills, you can teach them how to use Photoshop or teach them how to program, but you can't teach them to be smart, right? That's, by the time you get to somebody, they're as smart as they're going to get, and now you're just teaching them stuff. right? But whether or not they're just raw, intelligent people that can look at a problem and figure stuff out, yeah, you're not going to fix that, right? You can't fix stupid at this point. So we're looking for somebody who's very independent. We're looking for somebody who's just got gut, raw intelligence. You're looking for somebody who's really interested in solving problems. They're people, because this is, again, one of the, you're alone in a room. It's 2:00 in the morning because you decided to work at night because you wanted to go out to the park during the day. And now you can't solve this thing because something's broken. You can't just be the kind of person that's like, I don't know what to do now. I guess I got to quit. You've got to be the kind of person that's going to go on Google. You're going to, look for other people who had this kind of problem. You're going to search for stuff. Maybe your hard drive dies in the middle of the night and you need to figure out how to replace a hard drive and you've never done that before. Well, if you're in, podunk nowhere, Philippines, and you need to do that, well, there's probably not somebody who's going to come over to your house and do that for you right now. You got to sort that out yourself. So you need those kind of problem solvers. This is critical in this role. You need somebody who's reliable. Probably the quickest way to get fired out of my studio is for you to start breaking some of our protocols. You don't log on at 10 o'clock and people need to talk to you and you're not there and you can't ask questions to this person. That slows the whole team down. It gets everybody upset. You know what? You do that a couple times, you don't get to work in my studio anymore, right? We do, there are, we get a lot of worries about people saying, what if they're not working or whatever. And I always say, well, if you got those problems, then you've got bigger problems. Well, this is the bigger problem. If you've got somebody who's not reliable, you can't fix that. And I have tried many times to fix unreliable people, and I've ended up having to fire every last one of them. So, one of the things you're looking for, and we're going to talk in just a minute about how to test for this. You're looking for people that are really reliable. And the last thing, and this is really more important than you might think, you're looking for somebody who's a good social fit for your studio. And when I say a social fit for your studio, I specifically mean what you're doing is good for them, right? There are some people who don't want to work in a virtual studio. They don't want to work at home. They're young and they still consider their social lives to be entirely based around work. Maybe they like commuting. Maybe they live, with their parents and they really want to get out of the house and go to an office all day. There are people who don't want to work in this situation. That happens. And you're looking for people who this provides a real benefit for. I have found in general, and this is a gross generalization, but it does seem to be the case, that older, more experienced staff tend to value what we do more. And I think part of that is just, they've seen behind the curtain. They've worked for a while. They know how this all works. And they've kind of figured out, I could do this in my house. And they've also gotten old enough and a little bit more jaded towards the, woohoo, I'm part of the game team. And they're much more into, look, I want to do my work and then I want to spend time with my family. And for them, what we offer has huge value. And so in your negotiating position with those people, you can actually get really high value, experienced people on your team because they really value what you're doing in a virtual studio. That seems to be an important part of what we do. It's not true for everybody. We do get young people. We do train people. One of the values of the way we run our studio is because we can hire in, I guess I can say, lower cost locations, places like the Philippines where the labor's just cheaper. As long as we continue to pay higher rates, which we do, we can actually offer somebody straight out of college a great offer. We can say, look, we're going to pay you more than anybody else is going to pay you straight out of college, and we're going to train you. And that person, well, they're going to be around for a while. And because they're around for a while, I can put the time and energy into training them because I know that the retention is going to be there and that's going to pay back out in them being experienced. They're not just going to take that experience to my competitors and give it to them. They're going to keep it around my studio. So it's not always going to be older people or more experienced people, but I do find that you need to look at each person individually and ask, is this person going to value your offer? And we find, people who still, who have some kind of responsibility in their house, people who need to take care of somebody in their homes, people who live out in a city where there's not a lot of game jobs or a lot of tech jobs, not a lot of good work opportunities, but they want to stay in that city. That's somebody who really values what we do. And for them, we're offering a solution to a problem that they have. And that's going to increase retention. It's going to increase happiness. So we kind of preferentially hire for that. So yeah, that's how we hire into our studio. Those are the things that we look for. I want to talk now a little bit about how do you find those people, right? And the easiest way is test drive them with contract work. And we're going to talk a little bit about how I structure the teams and the kind of people that I put in. And there's sort of two kinds of people. We'll talk about this in a minute. There's people who are full-time exclusive contractors, and that's somebody who works for Boomzap. They don't work for anyone but Boomzap. This is their full-time job, right? And if you want, and that's a great position because we pay well, we treat people well. People love that job. They like doing that thing. If you want to get into that job, I'm probably not going to hire you directly into that job unless you're a very experienced person who I have a lot of faith in. If you're somebody who I think might do that job well, what I'll probably do is I'll hire you in as a contractor, and you're going to do something for me. Make a couple hidden object scenes, make a couple characters, and I'm going to see how you work. Are you reliable? Did you solve problems? Did you ask questions? Did you ask intelligent questions? Did you work independently? And of course, what's the quality of your work? I'm going to look at all those things that I just talked about preferentially hiring for, and I'm going to say, did they exhibit those qualities during the period of this short-term contract? If they didn't, well, great. We got their work. We paid them for their work. Have a nice life. Enjoy wherever you go from here. If they were, then great. Now we found somebody who we can actually, start investing some real time and energy in. That's somebody who might be a full-time employer for us. So that's my number one sort of suggestion. How do you find these people? Well, test drive them a little bit and see if they work out. So now that we've talked about that, okay, let's talk a little bit about how they fit in. What's the model? Now, as I've talked about before, we've got people all around the world. We have people in, Indonesia, the Philippines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, this poses a number of challenges legally, financially, et cetera. And you could set up a studio in each one of those different countries and pay taxes. That's a long, ugly road to walk, and I would not suggest doing it. Instead, I would suggest doing what we do, which is we have full-time exclusive contractors who are officially working freelance. And that means they pay their own taxes. That means they deal with all that themselves. We send them a check every month, right? And I promise, look, I'm going to send you a check every month. We have a contract that says, if I decide I don't want to send you a check every month, there's a certain period of time that I'll give you as a warning, usually longer than what most full-time jobs would give them in their own countries. And now, for all intents and purposes, they're a full-time worker for me. And there's an exclusivity agreement in that as well, which says, look, you're working for me. You're working only for me. I'm going to give you 40 hours of work a week. You're not doing work for anyone else while you're doing that. If you've got spare time, I want you out recharging your batteries or enjoying life. If you feel the need to do more work than 40 hours a week, come back to me and we'll pay you more money if you want to do more work more hours. I'm happy to do that. But in general, you should be exclusive to us, right? That's the standard Boomzap contract. Now, we also have task-based contractors. And in some cases, those are people that want to be full-time exclusive contractors, but we just don't know them that well yet. But in other cases, they're people who are doing very easily separatable modular work. So for instance, we have a number of people who are making hidden object scenes for our hidden object games, right? And that's a very salient single task. I know how long it takes to make a hidden object scene. I know how much work this is. You really don't have to understand a lot of the rest of the project to do this one part of the project. And so for them, I actually think there's a better risk reward for everyone if I pay those people by scene, because look, you want to work harder? You want to take on extra work? Great. Work faster and I'll give you more scenes, right? And I'll give you this work as fast as you chew through it, as long as you do it to a high level of quality. And so for those people, they can kind of set their own salary. If they want to work more, they can work more and they can earn more and they can do it through me. And that's great for everyone because I get more work done. If they want to work less, great. They naturally work less. I give that work to other contractors and I don't have to go back and bug them and say, hey, you're working slower than this person. Well, if you're working slower than this person, well, that's your problem because you're getting paid less per hour to do it because, that's how the math works. So for those kind of tasks, I actually like using those task-based contractors because I actually think it's more fair to them because they can actually control how quickly they earn that money and they can up it or down it however they want because they're not exclusive to me full-time. Now, there are people in the team that I think make more sense as full-time exclusive contractors. And again, this is based not on what's better for me, but what's more fair to them. If it's work that I'm going to be constantly wanting to redo or work that, hey, I need you to do this conceptual work, but I don't know if it's going to be great or not because I need to do this prototype and stuff like that. It's a little unfair to them to say like, okay, you're going to build me a prototype and it's going to cost X amount of dollars. And I don't know how deep that hole is or how long that's going to be. For somebody like that, I want to I want to be more fair to them and say, look, I don't know how long this thing's going to be. I don't know. Let's just pay you X dollars a month. And for X dollars a month, you're going to give me 40 hours a week. And we're all going to be happy because that's fair to everybody. And I think, this is the way we do it. You can do it how you want to do it. But the key lesson I would take away from this is not what's cheaper, right? That's not what's important. What's more important is what is more fair to the people that you're working with. Because again, I go back to the thing I say over and over and over again in these lectures. The most important thing that you have is finding people who work well in your system, work well with the studio, and that's going to require retention. And retention is going to require that your people are happy. And when you want your people to be happy, it's not about convincing them to be happy. It's about offering them the best possible alternative for their life. And in this case, we have those two contract models, and I put people on one of those two contract models based less on what's cheaper for me and more on what I think is going to be more fair to them in the long run. So that being said, a couple other little notes. One, I need to take a drink of tea before I get to this next note. I would say one of the big problems that I see when people people come to me and say, well, we tried working from home and it didn't work. One of the problems I see with this is because they had a two-tiered company. When I dig down a little deeper, I find that they were like, yeah, we had 3 employees and we let them work from home and it just didn't work out. And if you go back and you look at all the stuff I talked about, how we worked at the beginning of this, probably what ended up happening in a lot of those relationships were there was a lot of those water cooler meetings. There was a lot of documentation that wasn't given to them. There was a lot of information that wasn't given to them because they were sort of this second-class citizen somewhere else. And because they were that second-class citizen somewhere else, they weren't as effective as the people who were in your main office. I'm of the opinion, and there are people that disagree with me who are successfully doing this and disagree with me, that say, no, you can't have some people working in a studio and some people working out of the studio. I think there is a place for that, but I think the biggest friction you're going to get when you have that kind of relationship is you are going to have this sort of tiered, almost two-tiered kind of company. It's almost like a segregation between the people who get to be in the root company and the people who kind of get what those people choose to tell them about. That's going to be a problem. And so for us, I've always tried very hard to make sure that everybody is virtual, everybody's working from home, so we're all working on even footing. I think that's better. There are people that disagree with me on this. There are examples of this working that I can't deny. So, talk to those people. For me, I've found that it's always been better that we all work in the same model so that we all feel that we're equals. So that's something I would say. And when I talked about having people working on full-time exclusive contracts and people who are working on contracts per piece, aside from the payment model, they work exactly the same. If somebody is working for me and they're putting together hidden object scenes for X dollars per scene, I still expect them to check in every day. I still expect them to be available to chat to every day. I still expect to see works in progress from them. All the stuff that I talked about with our studio, that's true for anyone. However, whatever contract model they're on, they're still working with me that way, right? That keeps them from being divided into two kinds of people or two kinds of whatever. Now, that being said, your expectations for somebody who you've not dedicated, a monthly paycheck to, that person's expectations of how much information do I need to know about this project or how invested do I need to get in that project, you're going to have to maintain that. You're going to have to get them more excited about it. And one of the ways that you can do that is you can explain to somebody, look, here's how much of this contract work there is. If you're, and I think this is one of the places that people break down and do bad because they see this as sort of outsourcing and they see outsourcing as just a cost saving measure. And they're like, yeah, okay, I'll find the cheapest outsourcing I can and I'll put 500 scenes to 500 people. And those people are not invested in your project. Those people are not long-term invested in the success of your studio. They're not long-term invested in the success of your project. That's probably not something you want. I look at it very differently. I say, look, you're going to get paid on a different model because I think that's better for you. I think you're going to be able to make more money that way. Or in some cases, maybe you've got some other stuff that you're doing and you don't have time to invest 40 hours a week on me. And so this is a good way for you to work without me having to yell at you all the time. In either one of those situations, I'm doing this for you. I'm doing this to make this better for you. But for you, I want to be working with you long term. I want to invest in you. Either one of those two contract models. I want you working with me this month, next month, the month after. When I have more work, I want you to be the first person that I come to. And we have a group of contractors that are like that are sort of our go-to contractors. And when we have work, they know we're going to bring that work to them, right? And when they don't have work and they need work, they come to me and say, hey, is there work to be done? That's a very symbiotic relationship. It's a very healthy symbiotic relationship. And because we have that healthy symbiotic relationship, we can get them invested in our projects. We can say, hey, you do need to go read the game design doc, and you do need to know about this project, and maybe you do need to know about this license and these characters, and we can get them to do some of that work that would be a little more difficult if they thought, this is just a one-off deal and then I'm going to go work with some other 15 dudes. There is that level of involvement that you want to have, and you should be avoiding this sort of segregation of your studio between people who are in the studio and people who are working outsourced, blah, blah, blah. That's something you really want to avoid. I will also say, as you get your studio bigger, one of the big things you're going to look at is what I like to call a confederation of teams. Really any bigger than about 5 or 6 people, you're going to want to put somebody sort of in charge of that. Right, whatever that is. Maybe it's the people who are working on level design for your strategy game, or maybe it's people who are working on putting together a bunch of characters for your game, or maybe it's the people who are, any sort of large salient part of your project. You're going to want to break that down into team sizes of something like 5 to 7 people, not a lot bigger than 7 people. And each one of those kind of groups, you're going to put somebody in charge of that group. Now, 2 things. One, the person who's in charge of that group, they still work. Right? They're not like something separate from that group, right? If I've got, 6 people making hidden object scenes, I'm going to put one person in charge of those 6 people, but she's still going to be making hidden object scenes, right? Because I want her invested in what's happening. I want her knowing what's happening. I want her using those tools. I want her to intimately understand what the other people she's working with is. But that's, at least I can go to one person and say, hey, how's everyone coming along on the hidden object scenes? And that person can say, oh, well, June's doing this and Idril's doing this and Noog's doing this. And I can be, I don't have to go talk to each one of those people individually every single day, right? Now, I might, as the company manager, go talk to these people every now and then, but I don't want to have 5 different managers coming down and, I want them to have a pretty clear line of information for like, okay, it's Monday morning. Who do I get my task from? Well, Bless, she's in charge of these people. She's the person who's assigning tasks for hidden object scene makers. That's who you go to, right? So that sort of relationship is pretty important. And these little teams, they should be the same thing that your employees are. They should be empowered. They should be self-reliant. They should be independent, right? They should have minimal management. All of the stuff I talked about you wanting from one of your team members, you should want that from the teams themselves, right? So if that group of people runs into a problem, you don't want them just stopping and saying like, hey, we were working on these levels, but the programmer didn't give us this thing that we needed in our level design tool, so we haven't been working all week. Like, that's a problem, right? That's not behavior that you want. So you need those people to be the kind of people that would say, hey, I was trying to get this level done. We couldn't get this thing done. They bring that to the manager of that little group, and whoever that person is, that person comes to me, the person who runs the studio, and says, look, we are supposed to be building these levels. We can't build these levels because this feature isn't in our editor, or it's taken us forever to build these levels because this feature, and that's actually more important. It's not when you're stopped. It's when somebody looks at the work and says, this work is being done in a dumb way. We're wasting a lot of time because we don't have this tool that would save us a lot of time. And they come to you and say, hey, we need to make that thing happen. And now you, as the person in charge of the studio or in charge of the project, are going to go to that other team, that other group of people, and say, hey, this group of people over here, they're not getting their stuff done because they need this thing. I need you to put that into your task list. I need that to happen right now. You, as the sort of manager of the studio, that's your role. Your role is sort of looking at each one of these groups of people that are independently going and getting their stuff done and making sure that they have what they need. Do they have the tools? Do they have the resources? Maybe they need, whatever it is that they need to get working. They have that stuff, and they don't have to go sort that out themselves. So that's sort of how the team functions. You've got somebody in charge of all the small teams. The small teams have people that are all working, but one of those people is sort of the person who's more responsible than the rest. Those people do their jobs. This person reports back to you. That's how we run it. So that's kind of people management in a virtual studio. The only sort of last thing that I'll mention is when you're putting these together and when you're hiring people, it is easier to go north-south than it is to go east-west. And this is just a matter of time and space that we have not been able to overcome. People tend to want to work during normal business hours, whether you like it or not. People tend to want to eat lunch and breakfast and dinner. They have lives, and they have other people interacting with them that are going to expect them to work and live normal hours. And so if you're running a studio in San Francisco, hiring a bunch of artists in Ukraine, well, it's gonna be problematic. But if you're in Tokyo and you're hiring a bunch of people in Indonesia and the Philippines, that's going to be a lot easier because those people are going to be on a similar time zone to you. I wish I had a great solution for that, but this is just a matter of that's the way the world works. The sun moves at a certain speed, and that's how it is. So I would suggest looking for people that are not too far off your time zone. We usually think 3 or 4 hours off our time zone is sort of a limit. Anything beyond 3 hours off our time zone, it becomes pretty problematic. So we're not that excited about hiring somebody, for instance, in Europe in our studio. We just find that that's a real struggle for everybody. But yeah, that's it. So that's my notes on running a studio and hiring and managing something like what we've got. I have 2 more videos to go. And I hope these are useful to you. The next 2 videos, I'm going to talk a little bit about tools and how we specifically use certain tools. The next video, I'm going to talk about, the last video is going to be specifically about how do I work, how do the people in my studio work on a personal level, what does a day in my life look like, and how do I get really effective during that day. Those are going to be the next 2 videos. I hope this is useful to you. I'm going to be putting this up on YouTube. Theoretically, I'll put some links or whatever to our Discord or whatever. Maybe they'll be in the description or somewhere there'll be a link to our Discord. Come check out our Discord and have a chat with me. I also do live streams every now and then. You're welcome to come and check out one of our live streams. And I talk about game development and stuff in way more detail. You're happy to do that. And if there's anything else I can help with, please let me know in the comments down below. And I hope to see you in the next video.